Hi, my name's Danyluk. Many of my American friends actually know me as Alex. But I was born to Ukrainian immigrants who fled Soviet Ukraine during World War II, and he spent years trying to get to the United States. He spent 5 years in displaced persons camps in Germany, and eventually made it to the United States, where they established a family, and I was born. Today, my 92-year-old mother looks at the news on TV and sees herself in the eyes of the people that are the new refugees of Ukraine, history repeating itself a generation later. This picture is of my father and Reagan in the Oval Office. I remember that day well. He was there representing the Ukrainians in the diaspora and telling them how much people in the diaspora want a free and independent Ukraine from the Soviet Union. So the desire of Ukrainian independence is not new. In fact, the struggle for Ukrainian independence has lasted for a very long time. And allow me to go through a very quick modern history of Ukraine, starting in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Ukrainians cheered that day because the Soviet Union started to fall apart. And in fact, 2 years later, in 1991, there was a nationwide referendum in Ukraine to vote on the independence of Ukraine from the Soviet Union. And 92.3%, a massive amount of the Ukrainian population, voted to become an independent country separate from the Soviet Union. At that time, they were the third largest nuclear power in the world, behind the US and the Soviet Union. And so there was concern throughout the world of the nukes within Ukraine. And so UK, United States, and Russia, together with Ukraine, negotiated for Ukraine to give up all of its nuclear weapons. And in 1994, something called the Budapest Memorandum was signed, where those four countries agreed for Ukraine to give up its weapons and for everyone to respect the territorial boundaries of Ukraine and to agree not to use force to change those boundaries. Of course, that has not happened. In '96, the Constitution of Ukraine was finally signed, and so a new democratic country was on its way. But interference in Ukrainian affairs did not end. And so in 2004, just a short 8 years later, a presidential candidate was poisoned, a Western leading one, with dioxin. He survived, but not without significant damage to his health. There was massive voting fraud in Ukraine, and a Russian leading president was declared the winner. But the Ukrainian people knew that this was not correct, and so they took to the streets in what was called the Orange Revolution. They were in the center of Kiev in something called the Maidan. It was peaceful protests, and they continued and sustained those protests until the government agreed to rerun the elections. And when the election was redone and the votes were recounted, a Western-leading Democratic president was elected. And so Ukraine survived another critical test of democracy. Eventually, a Russian-leaning president was actually elected as president of Ukraine. And in 2014, in the 11th hour, he refused to sign an economic cooperation agreement with the European Union. The Ukrainian people were looking forward to stronger ties with Europe. And instead, this president, President Yanukovych, decided to try to foster an alliance with Putin and Russia. And so the people took to the streets again. This time, for 93 days in the winter of 2014 and 2014. It was called the Revolution of Dignity. And for 93 days, what started as a peaceful student protest escalated to a brutal oppression by the government forces. It culminated ultimately in sniper shootings into the crowds of protesters, killing about 100 citizens. But this only emboldened the Ukrainians that were protesting, and they gathered the next day and demanded the resignation of President Yanukovych, and he fled to Russia, where he was granted asylum. And so democracy survived yet another critical challenge in Ukraine. If you're not familiar with those 93 days, I highly recommend a Netflix Academy Award nominated documentary called Winter on Fire. It's a must-see to understand really the spirit of the Ukrainian people and what you see on the streets today. But in the chaos of Yanukovych's departure to Russia, Putin actually took advantage of that and seized Crimea, or Krim as we call it, in 2014, and fomented insurgency in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the Donbas region, and that insurgency continued for 8 years, a war on the eastern front of Ukraine that killed over 14,000 Ukrainian citizens, and that's before the latest invasion. And in 2019, they took yet another step towards Europe, where they actually changed their constitution and added into it 2 provisions. One, to join the European Union, and the second, to join NATO. Those steps may have been a step too far for Putin. And so we all know what has transpired since, just 2 years later. I have many friends and family members who were born in the United States but decided to emigrate or live in their ancestral home of Ukraine. They established businesses there and families and lives. A lawyer that is a cousin in Kiev and a friend that was actually in my wedding party that is an IT executive at a software development company in Lviv. The lawyer has made it out and has escaped Ukraine, but my friend has decided to stay in Lviv. I wish him well, and I wish all the others that are staying in Ukraine well. The brave people of Ukraine who we've seen on TVs, the inspirational images that we've seen, need our support because they cannot do this alone. They cannot save democracy again alone. And so several have asked me how they can help. And first, my answer is thank you. Thank you for asking and to do what you see fit, what you see in your heart. I personally am recommending a charity known as Razum for Ukraine. Razum means together in Ukrainian. It's a 501c3 that is headquartered in Little Ukraine in the heart of New York City. And it is very tightly connected to both the Ukrainian community in the United States and, of course, in Ukraine. Just in the first week after the invasion, they managed to raise $4 million from donations and have used those dollars and those funds for urgent medical supplies and other supplies and have sent them into the region, coordinating with other charities and even with other government agencies. So if you can, my recommendation would be to donate to Razum, but if you choose some other path, I thank you also. So in closing, I want to thank everyone that has reached out and thank everyone that stands with Ukraine. May the world find peace for the Ukrainian people. Thank you. Slava Ukraini.